Kentucky State Archives hold a single water-stained file that has baffled researchers for more than 170 years. Listed under unsolved cases from 1847, it tells the story of Jeremiah O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who vanished without a trace from his pig farm in Harrison County. What unsettles people most isn't only that no body was ever found, or that his wife Catherine began acting strangely in the weeks afterward, but that a record kept at the county clerk's office showed the O'Brien pigs gaining weight in a way that defied every farming practice of the time. Local newspapers refused to print the full details, and the sheriff's final report was locked away by court order. Even now, mentioning the O'Brien name in certain corners of Harrison County can make the old-timers grow quiet. This mystery begins not with a crime, but with a desperate choice, one that turned Catherine O'Brien from a struggling immigrant into something far more dangerous than anyone in Kentucky in 1847 could have imagined. Harrison County was then a patchwork of misty fields and small farms, a haven for Irish families fleeing famine, many lured by the promise of land and stability. Catherine Flanagan arrived 3 years earlier through a marriage arrangement made by the Catholic Church in Louisville. At just 24, she carried the hard edge of someone who had watched her homeland collapse under hunger and plague. Known among dock workers as the Firecat for her sharp gaze and fierce red hair. Tucked beneath a bonnet, Catherine left a lasting impression on those who met her. Her husband Jeremiah O'Brien was 15 years older and promised her 40 acres of farmland with a thriving pig business. What she found was 12 starving pigs, a collapsing barn, and a leaking 2-room cabin on rocky land that couldn't support crops with mortgage payments already behind. Jeremiah himself was a heavy-set man with gray hair and trembling hands, unless steadied by whiskey, spending most of his days gambling and drinking in the Irish Quarter, while Catherine scraped together pennies selling eggs and pigs. That was the reality Catherine walked into, a life that pushed her to the edge of survival, and into choices that would make her story echo through Harrison County for generations. The Irish families in Harrison County whispered that Jeremiah hadn't always been this way. Before his short stint in the Mexican conflict, he had been steady enough, but whatever happened during that war seemed to leave him mean-spirited and unreliable. Catherine, determined not to let his decline drag her under, poured every ounce of strength into rescuing the failing farm. She patched fences with her own hands, bargained with merchants for extra time on debts, and little by little began to rebuild the pig operation that was their only chance of staying afloat. Even the local American families, who usually regarded the Irish with suspicion, had to admit that Catherine O'Brien worked harder than most men. She rose before dawn, fed the animals, mended tools, cleaned pens, and by candlelight, drafted plans to stretch every dollar. The pigs, as if sensing her will to survive, began to thrive under her care. Drawing on the skills she had learned on her father's farm back in County Cork, she managed to turn the ragged herd into a growing business. By the end of 1846, she had 23 strong pigs and steady arrangements with butchers in Cynthiana and Georgetown. But for every dollar she earned, Jeremiah squandered 2. His gambling debts mounted, his drinking deepened, and his pride soured further each time her success highlighted his own failures. Other Irish men started keeping their distance, ashamed of his conduct and unsettled by the bitterness he directed toward his wife. Catherine learned to protect what she could, tucking coins away in mason jars beneath the cabin floorboards and memorizing every transaction in her head. The tension between them only grew sharper as winter set in. Jeremiah became obsessed with the talk of California gold, insisting they should sell the farm and head west. Catherine, seeing stability within reach, at last resisted fiercely. But their fights became louder and more dangerous, carrying through the hollow in the pre-dawn dark. By early 1847, neighbors noticed the change. Catherine, once quick with a smile, now carried herself with a guarded weariness. Her eyes, ringed with dark circles, betrayed long nights without rest, and her posture hinted at someone constantly braced for a blow. Jeremiah, meanwhile, seemed untethered, flashing money no one could trace, and boasting about grand plans for the future. The Irish community in Harrison County was bound tightly together by faith language and the need to endure as outsiders in an American county that never let them forget they were unwelcome. Yet even among their own, the O'Briens were becoming isolated. Catherine too proud to ask for help, Jeremiah too reckless to keep allies. Father Michael O'Connell, the traveling priest who served scattered Irish families, later testified that he had visited their farm twice in those first months of 1847. What he saw there would become part of the haunting record that survived long after Jeremiah disappeared. Father O'Connell would later recall Catherine as a woman carrying a heavy burden. She had pulled him aside during his visits and asked unsettling questions about whether the church permitted defending oneself, even with force, and how far a person might go to protect property. Years later, when pressed about those conversations, the priest would only say that he urged her to pray and reminded her that God sees every deed, even those carried out in the dark. The O'Brien farm itself sat at the end of a lonely dirt track branching off the road between Cynthiana and Millersburg. Thick woods pressed in on three sides, offering privacy that once felt like protection, but had since grown into a suffocating isolation. The closest neighbors, the Kellermans, were nearly a mile away, their farm separated by rough ground. On still nights, almost nothing carried beyond the hollow, a detail that would later haunt investigators trying to piece together what happened there in March of 1847. By that spring, Catherine had nearly doubled the herd to 29 pigs, each one fattened under her relentless care. Butchers were lining up to buy, and Catherine calculated that a single large sale could wipe away their debts and give her the resources to rebuild the barn and expand the operation properly. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a secure future. That fragile hope collapsed the night she found Jeremiah's secret. Buried in an old tobacco tin beneath his side of the bed were letters from a Louisville land speculator. They outlined his plan to sell the farm, take the profits, and disappear west. Worse still, the correspondence revealed he wasn't planning to go alone. He meant to run off with Mary Brennan, a young widow from Georgetown's Irish community. For Catherine, the betrayal was devastating. She had poured her youth, her strength, and her sanity into dragging Jeremiah's ruin of a farm back from the edge, only to find he had been plotting for months to rob her of everything. Under Kentucky law, she had no legal standing to stop him. The land was in his name alone. In the gray, suffocating air of March 15th, 1847, she rose before dawn, as always, fed the pigs, gathered eggs, and tried to steady her thoughts. The decision had come to her in the restless hours of the night as she lay beside Jeremiah, listening to his uneven, whiskey-heavy breathing. She could not let him sell her future out from under her. By mid-morning, the mist still hung in the trees when Jeremiah stumbled out of the cabin reeking of liquor, his shirt soiled and hair uncombed, eyes bloodshot from days of drinking. Catherine, calm, in a way she had never felt before, knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. Jeremiah muttered something about heading into town and shuffled toward the stable where their old mare Bridget waited. But Catherine's voice cut through the damp morning air and froze him in place. "We need to talk, Jeremiah." She stood by the pig pen, her bonnet slipping enough to show a streak of fiery red hair, the bucket of scraps resting at her feet. The sharpness in her tone made him turn, suspicion briefly clearing the haze in his eyes. Talk about what he asked, though his evasive glance betrayed that he already knew. Catherine set down the bucket, reached into her apron, and pulled out the letters she had discovered. Without a word, she held them up. The flicker of recognition on Jeremiah's face hardened into anger. "You had no right digging through my things," he snapped, slurring but gaining force. "Private papers. Private plans to sell this farm and run off with Mary Brennan." Catherine shot back, her voice steady, even as her chest burned with rage. 3 years of my work, Jeremiah. My sweat, my hands rebuilding this place while you drowned yourself in whiskey. This farm is mine. His fists tightened as he stepped closer. Your farm. My name's on the deed, my signature on the mortgage. You're just the wife. You don't own a damn thing. The words struck like blows, but Catherine didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in the sleepless hours of the night. "I won't let you do it," she said. Jeremiah's laugh was jagged bitter. "Won't let me? You think you have a say? Papers are already signed. McReynolds is coming tomorrow. By next week I'll be in California, and you can figure out how to feed yourself." "And the pigs?" Catherine asked, motioning toward the herd of 29 healthy animals rooting in the pen. "What about everything we've built?" Jeremiah's sneer deepened. You did the work, and I was supposed to be grateful for a wife who plays the man of the house. I'm done pretending this marriage was anything but a mistake." He lifted his hand to strike her, something he had done more often in recent weeks. But this time Catherine didn't recoil. Her calm stare, sharp and unyielding, made him hesitate. "You're not leaving Jeremiah," she said quietly. Something in her tone cut through the liquor clouding his mind. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "What are you talking about? I said you're not leaving." "This farm stays in the family, and so do you." His uncertainty curdled back into anger, pride stoked by drink. "You can't stop me. You're nothing but an Irish peasant who should be grateful any man would take you." He lunged, arms swinging down in the familiar threat of violence. But Catherine was ready. With a quick, practiced motion, she seized the heavy wooden feeding ladle from the bucket and swung. The crack against his temple rang sharp in the misty air. Jeremiah staggered back, eyes wide in shock more than pain, pressing his bloody fingers to the wound. "You crazy bitch," he muttered, disbelief dripping from his voice. "You actually hit me." Catherine stood her ground, the ladle firm in her grip. "I warned you," she said, her pulse racing, but her voice steady as stone. "I told you you're not leaving." Catherine's words hung in the damp morning air as Jeremiah straightened, blood trickling down his temple. She saw the exact instant when disbelief hardened into pure fury. His face darkened, and his trembling hands steadied into something more dangerous than whiskey shakes. "You're going to regret that," he hissed, advancing with slow, deliberate steps. "I'll show you what happens to a wife who forgets her place." That was when she noticed the gleam in his right hand. The hayhook, sharp and curved, a tool built for muscle, but perfectly capable of killing. His eyes told her everything. If she didn't act, she would die. The world narrowed to slow motion clarity. She saw his arm lift the metal hook, arcing toward her in the weak light of morning. She smelled manure and wet earth sounds of pigs shifting in the pen, the drip of water from the cabin roof. She knew exactly what she had to do. When it was over, the silence was so complete it seemed to press against her ears. Jeremiah lay sprawled beside the pen, eyes wide, his mouth frozen in a final gasp of surprise. The hayhook had slipped from his fingers, landing in the mud. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath his head, though not as much as Catherine expected. The second strike with the wooden ladle had landed just behind his ear, the perfect angle, the perfect force. He had died before the hook could ever come down. For 5 long minutes, Catherine stood frozen, staring at what she had done. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the ladle again before she let it clatter to the ground. The truth hit her like a weight on her chest. She was now a widow not by fate, but by her own hand. And the law would never forgive her. In Kentucky, a husband owned the land, the house the livestock, and by extension, the woman who worked beside him. If she claimed self-defense, no jury of American men would side with an Irish wife against her dead husband. Worse still, Jeremiah's body itself was now a problem she couldn't ignore. Nearly 200 pounds of dead weight, impossible to move alone, impossible to bury without help. Help she could not ask for. She couldn't leave him lying there either. Neighbors might stumble across the body, or the priest would arrive within weeks. That was when Catherine noticed the pigs. They had gathered at the fence, restless snouts twitching at the smell of blood. Their eyes fixed on her with a strange, eager focus. A few of the larger boars let out a deep rolling sound, the same noise they made when they sensed food was near. The idea didn't strike all at once, but rose slowly, horrifying and practical from her knowledge of farming. Pigs, she knew, would eat nearly anything. Their jaws could crush bone-grind teeth, even strip away hair. Catherine stood in the mist, her breath shallow, realizing that the solution to Jeremiah's body might already be waiting just a few feet away. Irish farmers had long known pigs could dispose of organic waste better than any other rural method. And where horror might have lodged in another woman, Catherine found only the same calm, practical efficiency she applied to every farm problem, sizing up logistics as if she were solving a feeding schedule. The pigs were hungry. She had delayed their morning meal because of the fight. The pen was big enough, the fence high enough to hide what needed doing from a passing neighbor. And the Kellermans lived a mile away. So any noise would pass as ordinary farm work, so she walked around Jeremiah studying angles and weight and the best way to move a nearly 200-pound body by herself, knowing she could drag him in pieces if necessary. Though the thought made her stomach turn and realized the plan solved every problem, at once it would erase the body, preserve the story that he had gone to California, and feed the herd that represented her only chance of survival. She changed into her oldest work dress, gathered knives, rope, a tarp, and a bottle of his whiskey to steady her hands, then worked with a steady, methodical determination through morning into afternoon, checking the road, resting when she needed, feeding the pigs more generously than they had seen in months. Until by evening there remained nothing of Jeremiah, but a dark stain in the mud that she covered with fresh hay and manure. And she burned his clothes and scattered the ashes into the hearth with ordinary wood ash, cleaned the tools and put them back, and sat up that night by the fire, thinking through each detail, feeling no guilt for the killing, because she believed he had meant to kill her, feeling only the complicated weight of what she had done to survive. And in the days after, she put her cover story into motion, telling neighbors he had left for California and would send for her when he was settled. Jeremiah's disappearance fit neatly enough with his known plans that most neighbors accepted Catherine's explanation without much suspicion. They had heard him speak often of California, and his sudden absence seemed in line with his erratic behavior. A few found it strange that he had gone without farewells, but chalked it up to his restless, impulsive nature. When Father O'Connell stopped by 2 weeks later, he pressed Catherine with pointed questions. She answered smoothly, saying Jeremiah had seized a chance to travel west with other men chasing gold. The priest's eyes lingered on her longer than was comfortable, but he left without comment, his doubts unspoken. The greater challenge lay in Jeremiah's debts. Once it became known, he had left town creditors descended demanding repayment. Catherine discovered his gambling losses were far worse than she had realized. To quiet the demands, she sold most of her herd sooner than planned, settling debts and reinforcing the illusion she was simply managing affairs until her husband returned. The pigs she kept, those that had feasted on Jeremiah, flourished beyond all expectation. They grew faster, heavier, stronger than any stock in the county, and neighbors began whispering about the remarkable health of the O'Brien herd. Catherine attributed their condition to her special feeding methods, which was true enough, though no one pressed for details she would not have given. As spring slid into summer, life on the farm transformed. With Jeremiah's drinking and gambling gone, the place began to prosper. Catherine repaired the leaking roof, built an extension for a proper kitchen, reinforced fencing, and raised a larger pen to give her pigs more room. Most important, she made the last payment on the farm, securing the deed in her name, a rare independence for a woman in Kentucky at that time. Neighbors noticed the change in her as much as they noticed the change in her pigs. Mary Kellerman remarked that Catherine seemed lighter, happier, as if a great weight had lifted. She laughed more, carried herself with confidence, and her health improved visibly. Yet other changes unsettled people. Catherine guarded her remaining pigs with an almost obsessive protectiveness, refusing generous offers from butchers and breeders alike, insisting they were essential breeding stock. She spent hours with them, speaking in Irish Gaelic, treating them with a tenderness that bordered on devotion. Farmers across Harrison County marveled at the size and vitality of her animals, their glossy coats and powerful builds, unlike anything they had seen. She claimed her success came from a special feed mixture, but never revealed the recipe, turning aside questions with a thin smile. The mystery deepened in late June when Thomas McReynolds, the land speculator who had been corresponding with Jeremiah about selling the farm, arrived in Harrison County to finalize the deal, only to find Catherine firmly in possession of the land, the deed now secured in her own name. Thomas McReynolds arrived in Harrison County expecting a routine transaction. A polished speculator from Louisville, he had built his fortune buying out desperate immigrants and reselling their land to wealthier American families. His correspondence with Jeremiah had led him to believe the sale was all but complete. Instead, he found Catherine firmly in charge, the farm thriving, and Jeremiah nowhere in sight. Calm and composed, she explained that her husband had changed his mind and sent word from California instructing her to cancel the deal. To back her claim, she produced a letter in Jeremiah's hand, complete with familiar phrasing and details that lent it an air of authenticity. Still, McReynolds wasn't convinced. In 15 years of business, he confided later at the tavern in Cynthiana, "I've never seen a man swing so suddenly." Jeremiah O'Brien couldn't talk about anything but California, and now we're to believe he wants to cling to this patch of hillside. His doubts grew as he asked questions around the county. No one had seen Jeremiah depart. Catherine claimed he slipped away before dawn to meet fellow travelers in Georgetown. But the story rang hollow to neighbors who remembered how social he had been. More troubling was the fact that Jeremiah's horse, a tired but reliable mare, remained in the stable. For a man supposedly bound for California, it was a glaring inconsistency. When McReynolds confronted Catherine, she never faltered. She explained that Jeremiah had intended to buy a stronger mount in Georgetown, that his lack of letters was in keeping with his careless habits, and that the message she produced had been carried back by an Irishman returning from the gold fields, which was why it bore no postal stamp. Her answers were crisp, plausible, and delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had rehearsed them. McReynolds left unconvinced, but without evidence or legal standing. He had no choice but to walk away, his suspicions unvoiced but far from resolved. The letter Catherine produced appeared authentic enough to stand on its own. It canceled Jeremiah's agreement with McReynolds in clear language, and combined with the fact that she had paid off the mortgage, it cemented her legal claim to the land. After a week of asking questions and finding no evidence he could use, McReynolds reluctantly returned to Louisville. Still, he left behind acquaintances who kept one eye on the O'Brien farm, whispering their suspicions and waiting for some misstep. While the land speculators' doubts faded into rumor, Catherine faced a subtler but more dangerous form of scrutiny from her own community. Word had begun to spread among the Irish women that something about her was changing. She no longer joined in the small gatherings where families shared news and supported one another, nor did she participate in the work projects that bound their fragile community together. Instead, she kept to herself, dealing with neighbors only when business demanded it. Some claimed she had grown cold, even calculating a shift they found unnatural in a woman living alone after her husband's sudden departure. The most unsettling rumors came from children who had wandered close to the O'Brien farm. They said Catherine spent long stretches talking to her pigs as if they understood her, switching between English and a harsh muttered Gaelic that even other Irish speakers struggled to follow. She fed the animals at odd hours, often in the dead of night, and with portions so generous that they seemed far too much for the handful of pigs she kept. Father O'Connell decided he could no longer ignore these reports. In early August, he made the trek back to the farm, publicly framing the visit as concern for Catherine's spiritual welfare, though privately determined to gauge the truth of the unsettling stories. He found her in the garden, which had grown dramatically since his last call, and now contained herbs and vegetables he did not recognize. Catherine greeted him politely, but without warmth, her manner more businesslike than deferential. "I've been concerned about you, my child," he said as they walked toward the cabin. "Living alone on this farm must be difficult." "I manage just fine, Father," she answered. "Better than I ever did when Jeremiah was here." The priest was struck by the sharpness in her tone when she spoke her husband's name. There was no affection, no grief, only a flat dismissal. He pressed gently. "Have you heard from your husband recently?" "Not directly, but I know he's well," she replied, her gaze sliding past him to the pig pen. "He's probably too busy with gold to bother writing." The pigs had gathered by the fence, their eyes fixed on Catherine in a way that made Father O'Connell uneasy. They were undeniably healthy, larger, and sleeker than any swine he had seen in the county. But there was something disquieting in their attention, as if they were waiting for her. "Some of your neighbors are worried," he said. "They think you've pulled away from the community." "I have work to do," Catherine answered flatly. "The farm won't run itself, and I've no time for gossip." Though her words were proper, her demeanor unsettled him. She avoided his eyes, shifted her weight, as if guarding a secret, and always seemed half-turned toward the pig pen. Worst of all was her utter absence of emotion when speaking of Jeremiah. No longing, no sorrow, not even irritation at his silence. Just an emptiness that felt unnatural. Before leaving, the priest asked to see the letter Catherine claimed to have received from California. She agreed without hesitation, but as she went to retrieve it, Father O'Connell could not shake the sense that something was deeply wrong at the O'Brien farm. Catherine handed over the letter without hesitation, and at first glance it looked convincing. The handwriting matched Jeremiah's signature on other documents, but the phrasing gnawed at Father O'Connell. It was oddly precise in certain details, yet vague in others, as if crafted by someone trying too hard to mimic another's voice. That evening, unsettled by what he had seen, he confided in Patrick Kellerman. "There's something wrong at the O'Brien farm," he said gravely. "I can't point to proof, but that woman is hiding something." Kellerman admitted his family had noticed changes as well. His children swore they had heard strange noises carrying from the O'Brien place at night. "Should we tell the sheriff?" he asked. O'Connell shook his head. "On what evidence she says her husband is alive in California? She's committed no crime we can prove." mark my words, something terrible has happened, and we'll regret waiting to act." As August wore on, Harrison County was gripped by an unusual drought. Creeks shrank to muddy pools, gardens withered despite back-breaking effort, and livestock across the county grew thin and sickly. Farmers worried aloud about how they would survive the coming winter. Yet at the O'Brien farm, conditions seemed strangely untouched. Catherine's garden thrived with lush vegetables and herbs, her pigs grew even larger and healthier, and her farm gave off an air of prosperity while her neighbors' lands struggled. The contrast quickly became a subject of gossip. "It isn't natural," Sarah Brennan muttered bitterly. "Nobody's pigs look like that in a drought. She must be getting feed from somewhere, but where? And how's she paying for it?" Local merchants confirmed what made the situation even more puzzling. Catherine hadn't purchased feed grain or corn from any of the usual suppliers since early summer. Yet her animals were thriving, becoming the envy of every farmer who saw them. At the end of August, Thomas McReynolds reappeared in Harrison County this time, with a young attorney from Louisville named Jonathan Hayes. He had never shaken his suspicion about Catherine's story, and now he intended to find a way to challenge her control of the farm. Together, he and Hayes spent days interviewing neighbors, combing through courthouse records, and looking for cracks in Catherine's narrative. What they uncovered didn't settle the matter. It only deepened the mystery surrounding Jeremiah O'Brien's vanishing and the farm that seemed to defy the drought. The letter of cancellation, the paid-off mortgage, and the settled debts had given Catherine the appearance of legitimacy. But McReynolds and Hayes could smell inconsistencies in every corner of her story. Neighbors confirmed no one had actually seen Jeremiah leave for California. His horse was still in the stable, his absence too clean and convenient. The lawyers pressed Catherine, demanding to know how she had conjured enough money to erase debts and mortgages within days of his supposed departure. Catherine stuck to her explanation. She had sold pigs to traveling merchants who couldn't be traced. She had followed her husband's instructions. She was merely keeping the farm afloat until he returned. Her green eyes flashed when pressed, her tone sharp and dismissive. To Hayes, she looked less like a grieving wife and more like a woman defending a secret with sharpened claws. McReynolds finally voiced what others had only whispered. "I don't believe Jeremiah ever left this farm." The words cut through the humid air like a blade. Catherine's face remained steady, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor. Behind her, the pigs gathered along the fence as if drawn to the tension, their eyes following every movement. She countered with legal documents and the infamous California letter mocking the suggestion that a woman her size could have harmed a man like Jeremiah. Hayes softened his tone, suggesting accidents happen, that people panic and cover their mistakes. Catherine's response was a dagger cloaked in civility. The only poor decision was wasting time harassing a widow who had built a thriving farm in the middle of a drought. She gestured toward her lush garden and massive pigs, daring them to doubt what they saw with their own eyes. McReynolds' gaze lingered on the animals. They were shockingly robust, their hides glossy, their bodies fuller than any pigs he had seen in a season of scarcity. "Fine animals." "Mrs. O'Brien," he said slowly, "what exactly do you feed them?" Catherine's reply was clipped scraps, garden waste, old Irish methods. Her smile was tight defensive. Perhaps Kentucky farmers could learn something from Irish techniques. As the two men turned to leave, Hayes' attention snagged on a glint at the corner of the pig pen. Pushing aside a tuft of hay, he caught sight of a metal belt buckle, tarnished but unmistakably human in origin. He bent slightly, then spoke with forced casualness. "Mrs. O'Brien, you might want to tidy around your pen. There's some debris there that could injure the animals." Catherine's eyes followed his gesture, and for the briefest instant her mask slipped. fear flickered across her face, raw and undeniable, before she smoothed it away and stood straighter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Hayes said nothing more, but as he and McReynolds rode away, the buckle's dull shine lingered in his mind, a silent clue hinting at a truth far darker than either man had dared to imagine. "Thank you for pointing that out," Catherine had said, her voice smooth but tight, and as McReynolds and Hayes walked away, they heard her murmuring softly to the pigs. Sounds so strange and intimate that both men quickened their pace without realizing it. Once out of earshot, Hayes broke the silence. That buckle wasn't just debris. You saw how she froze. McReynolds' expression was grim. I saw. And we both know whose it was. That night they gathered at the tavern with Father O'Connell and Patrick Kellerman, laying their suspicions bare. The priest shared his own troubling observations, unnaturally large fires. Late at night, far too big for household rubbish, and repeated sightings of Catherine lingering in the pig pen after dark. Kellerman added that his youngest boy swore he'd seen her whispering to the animals, as though she were thanking them, a memory that left him shaken. Hayes leaned in, voice low. "Gentlemen, I believe Catherine O'Brien killed her husband. And I believe she disposed of him in a way that left nothing for us to find." McReynolds paled. "You don't mean Hayes cut him off? Those pigs didn't grow fat on scraps alone. We all know it." A heavy silence settled over the table, until Father O'Connell spoke his words, weighted with dread. "If this is true, then it is more than murder. It is something so vile it poisons the very soul of this parish." McReynolds cleared his throat. "Then what do we do? Without proof, accusing her could ruin us." Kellerman urged that the sheriff be brought in, but Hayes shook his head. "The sheriff will demand evidence, and we have nothing but suspicions and a tarnished buckle." Unseen, a figure lingered outside the tavern window, listening. Catherine had trailed them into town, gliding through the dark with the stealth of someone who had been practicing secrecy for months. The words she caught chilled and angered her in equal measure. They were too close now. Too close to unraveling everything she had built. The buckle had been a mistake, and she knew it. But she also knew what had to be done. If these men thought they were closing in, they had gravely underestimated the woman they were hunting. She slipped back into the night with a grim smile. Tomorrow she would make sure their suspicions never hardened into proof. She had learned well how to erase problems. And if pigs could make one body vanish, she saw no reason they couldn't handle more. On September 3, 1847, Sheriff William Hartwell rode into Harrison County to answer formal complaints from McReynolds and Hayes. Hartwell was a steady man in his 50s, more accustomed to settling land disputes and breaking up tavern brawls than probing into whispered tales of murder. He began with skepticism, assuming the O'Brien matter was a domestic quarrel inflated by gossip. Yet the pile of small inconsistencies, Catherine's financial windfall, the unpurchased feed, the letter that felt too convenient, was enough to convince him an official inquiry was necessary. Through the Irish network, Catherine heard the sheriff was on his way, giving her nearly 6 hours to prepare before Hartwell appeared at her farm on the morning of September 4th. 6 hours was more than enough time for Catherine O'Brien, who had already proven she could outwork, outplan, and outlast every man who thought he understood her. She used the hours before Hartwell arrived to tidy the place and burn anything that might still incriminate her. Then opened the door with the same weary politeness she'd shown the men from Louisville, and invited the sheriff in for coffee while she answered his questions. Hartwell wasted no time laying out the numbers that didn't add up. The mortgage paid in full, debts cleared, about $800 unaccounted for, and asking where the money had come from. And Catherine stuck to her story about hurried pig sales and Jeremiah's instructions. though Hartwell noticed her hands rubbing her skirt and caught the first tremor of uncertainty when she could not name the buyers. He stood and looked out at the pig pen, commenting that he'd never seen stock so well kept in a drought, and pressed her on feed sources until her answers grew thin and anxious. Then, with deliberate calm, he produced the belt buckle Hayes had found, the one stamped with Jeremiah's initials and a Celtic knot, and set it on the table between them. Catherine stared until her face went pale, offered the faintest, weakest versions of explanations. Maybe he lost it. Maybe it had been there for months, but when Hartwell noted the buckle's corrosion and that it had been buried under hay and manure long enough to age something inside her, snapped, and she finally spoke, voice raw and urgent, telling him about the hay hook raised over her, about the way Jeremiah had come at her ready to kill, about the second fatal blow with the ladle, the horror of what she'd done, and the desperate practical choice afterward to feed his body to the pigs, to erase the proof words, tumbling out like a confession, at last relieved of months of careful silence. Catherine laid out the confrontation in stark terms. Jeremiah's threats, the hay hook, her frantic swing of the ladle, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what had become of his body. When Hartwell pressed her, asking where Jeremiah was, now her gaze drifted to the pig pen. The sheriff followed it, and the truth dawned on him with sickening clarity. "Dear God," he muttered. Catherine's reply was flat, emptied of all feeling. "They were hungry. I couldn't bury him. I couldn't move him. The pigs, they don't leave anything behind." Hartwell had seen killings in his time, but never anything like this. It wasn't just murder, it was obliteration. When he asked who else knew, Catherine told him, "No one. Just you and me." But even as she said it, she knew her life, as she had rebuilt it, was finished. The law would not forgive her, not for this. Desperation flickered in her eyes. She lunged for a knife on the table, but Hartwell's reflexes were quicker. He caught her wrist, twisted her arms behind her back, and locked the cuffs in place as she slumped in defeat. Looking once more toward the pigs, watching through the fence, Catherine heard their grunts in her mind, as if they were bidding her farewell.